Welcome to the second session of Introduction to Biblical Apologetics. I'm Brother Leslie Joseph Buckland Jr. And we don't have any of the original writings of the Bible writers that they think that it must have a lot of errors in it, and how can we really trust that book? So we're going to be investigating that allegation of the Bible not being accurately copied and transmitted from one generation to another in this second hour of Introduction to Biblical Apologetics. We're looking now at the general objectives. Number one, to examine atheist claims that the Bible has not been accurately transmitted or passed down from one generation to another to our present time. Two, to examine answers to these atheist claims. The specific objectives are: one, at the end of this lesson, the students will have been able to analyze atheist claims that the Bible has not been accurately transmitted. Number two, at the end of this lesson, the students will have been able to discuss answers to these atheist claims. Atheist claims that the Bible has not been accurately transmitted are as follows. Number one, they claim that there are no original books of the Bible written by the authors themselves. Two, they claim there are only copies of copies which were made by many generations of scribes, and the word scribes means copyists, who make copies by writing with their own hands. I will repeat the second claim of atheists, that the Bible has not been accurately transmitted. They claim there are only copies of copies, which were made by many generations of scribes. Scribes means copyists, who write down a new copy of the Bible when the old copy is worn out, such as the pages are getting torn and the ink is fading away. And so they are called scribes, who made copies by writing with their own hands, for there were no printing presses in those days. The printing press was invented about 350 years after the last handwritten copy of the Old Testament was made. Just a little intermission here. Isha is still on Skype. Okay.
Listen.
Good. Number three, the atheists claim that there are numerous different ways that the copies of the Bible have been written. Number four, the atheists claim that the Bible has not been accurately transmitted or passed down to us. And so they ask, number five, how can anyone base their faith on what the Bible has said? And that is what we're going to be examining in this second hour of apologetics. So let us look now at answers to the atheist claims that the Bible has not been accurately transmitted. But first of all, I'm going to admit to certain things that the atheists claim. Whenever the atheist says something correct or true, I will acknowledge it. And so I begin. Number one, it is true that the original books of the Bible written by the inspired authors have not been discovered. Number two, it is true that the Bible that we have today is one of many translations from copies of the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek sections of the Bible. Number 3, it is true that for many centuries, different generations of scribes or copyists have copied the Bible down with their own hand, and these copies, which have been found so far, date from about 250 BC, that is, 250 years before Jesus Christ was born, until 1100 AD, or 1,100 years after Christ was born. That is a period of 1,350 years of copying by hand. That's a long time to copy writings down. Number 4, it is true that the copies of the Bible have in certain places different words from each other. Concerning the different words in the different copies of the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek sections of the Bible, these do not affect any teaching in the Bible. For example, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 5, some Greek copies say that Jesus washed us from our sins in his own blood. And other Greek copies say, loosed or released us from our sins in his own blood. The Greek copies that say washed use the Greek word luo, and that is spelled in Greek letters someone remind me of the Greek letter L. Just forgot it. Lambda, that's it, lambda. So you have lambda, omicron, upsilon, and omicron. In English letters, that's L-O-U-O, pronounced luo. That means to loose or to release. No, that means to wash. That means to wash. L-O-U-O means to wash. But the Greek copies that say loosed or released use the Greek word luo, spelt lambda, upsilon, omicron, which means to loose or to release. And notice, both Greek words are pronounced in the same way. L-O-U-O is pronounced luo, and L-U-O is pronounced luo. And it is easy to see how the difference in copying this Greek word took place. However, whether washed was the original word that was used, or loosed and released was the original word that was used, neither word changes the teaching in the Bible that when Jesus' blood was shed, he made it possible for people to be washed so that their sins against God might be removed and that they might not be punished, or he made it possible for people to be loosed or released from the guilt of sins so that God may forgive them and not have to punish them. The different wording does not change the meaning of the Bible's teaching that Jesus' blood brings God's forgiveness and the promise of a place in the kingdom of heaven to those who become his followers. And I find this to be a general rule. I've just given you one example, but this is a general rule of how the different words used in the different copies of the Bible do not change any teaching in the Bible. Number 5, atheists believe that until the printing press was invented in 1450 AD, copies of the Bible would have been full of errors. However, it is not necessarily true that because the printing press has been invented, that printing new copies of the Bible has made the Bible more accurate than when scribes wrote the Bible down by hand. For if an error is made in putting the information into the printing press, this same error is going to be printed in every book that is produced from it. There is abundant evidence that the scribes who copied the Bible down by hand were more accurate than the printing press. Now, I know that may sound far-fetched or unbelievable, but I'm going to present to you evidences that the scribes who wrote the Bible down by hand were really far more accurate in their copying of the Bible than the printing press is today. Let us look at number 6 for such evidences that the scribes who copied the Bible down by hand were more accurate than the printing press is today. There were rules governing the copying of the Bible that ensured accurate copying of the Bible was done. Rule number 1, the scribes had to be of good standing. That is, very respectful of God and of the Bible, and not wanting to change even one letter of the Bible. The second rule governing the copying of the Bible is the scribes had to be knowledgeable of the Bible. The third rule governing the copying of the Bible is the scribes were forbidden to copy any letter or word of the Bible from memory, but they had to look at the scroll or the book that they were copying. The fourth rule governing the copying of the Bible is they had to pronounce each word before writing it down. The fifth rule governing the copying of the Bible is writing was done in straight lines so that one line would not run into another line. The sixth rule governing the copying of the Bible is each written column of the scroll was to have no fewer than 48 and no more than 60 lines, whose breadth must consist of 30 letters. So they carefully counted the letters and they carefully counted the words. The seventh rule governing the copying of the Bible is there was to be the space of a hair between each consonant and the space of a small consonant between each word. The eighth rule governing the copying of the Bible is there were to be margins on all sides of the written surface to enable the scroll to be handled without touching the written area. So they ensured that the ink was not smeared by fingers. The seventh rule, or the ninth rule rather, governing the copying of the Bible is they were not to interrupt their work to do anything else until they were finished. The 10th rule governing the copying of the Bible is the temple employed correctors who closely examined the scrolls to identify if there were any errors so that these errors may be corrected. If as many as 3 pages needed correction, the entire scroll had to be copied over again. The 11th rule governing the copying of the Bible is most of the copying was done on leather, which lasts a longer time than papyrus which is paper made from the reeds of the Nile River in Egypt. That is why most of the scrolls were made of leather, and only a few we have in papyrus. The 12th rule governing the copying of the Bible is the scrolls were stored in synagogues for safekeeping and preservation. And here is an example of a scroll. The scribes copied the Bible with great reverence for God. Now, these scribes were so careful in copying the Bible that when the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible, which were made between AD 800 and AD 1100, were copied with the Hebrew scrolls found in caves by the western section of the Dead Sea in 1947, which are called the Dead Sea Scrolls, which themselves were dated between 250 BC and AD 135, they were found to be almost word for word the same, or very similar, or virtually identical. That's why I believe these men who copied the Bible down were more accurate than the printing press is today. Another way of knowing that the Bible has been transmitted accurately by the scribes is that they were copied nearer to the date when the original books were written. For example, the Hebrew Old Testament was completely written by the authors in 400 BC. The earliest copy of the Hebrew Old Testament, 150 BC. That is just 150 years after the Hebrew Old Testament was completely written. The Greek New Testament was completely written by AD 96 with the writing of the book of Revelation. The earliest copy of the book of Revelation was dated at between AD 125 to AD 130, plus or minus 25 years. That is just about between 29 and 34 years after the Apostle John had written the book of Revelation. No other book in ancient history has been copied so close in time to the actual composition by the original writers. For example, Homer's Iliad, which is a poetical presentation of the Trojan Wars in Greece, was written in 800 BC, but the earliest copy of it is dated at 415 BC, which is 385 years later. Herodotus composed a history of the Grecian-Persian Wars in 425 BC, but the earliest copy of it is dated between 150 to 50 BC. That is a gap of about 275 years to 375 years. There are more ancient copies of the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek sections of the Bible than any other ancient book. There are 42,300 copies of the Hebrew and Aramaic sections of the Bible, and 5,856 copies of the Greek sections of the Bible, making a total of 48,156 copies of the Bible in its original languages. In contrast, there are only 1,100 900 copies of Homer's Iliad, and only 106 copies of Herodotus's history of the Grecian-Persian Wars. Since people do not have a problem with accepting the historical reliability of Homer's Iliad and of Herodotus's history of the Grecian-Persian Wars, they should have no problem accepting the historical reliability of the Bible. Therefore, since the scribes were extremely careful in copying the Bible, and since each copy of the Bible was examined carefully for mistakes by correctors, and since the Dead Sea Scrolls have shown how later copies of the Hebrew Aramaic sections of the Bible are almost word for word the same as in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and since the differences in some words in the copies do not change any teaching in the Bible, and since the copies of the Bible were written closer in time to the original composition of the Bible than any other ancient book, and since there are far more copies of the Bible in its original languages than any other ancient book, we may conclude that the translations that are made from the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek sections of the Bible are the same as what was written by the original writers of the books of the Bible. Now, these are sources of information for the lesson that I have just presented. I got much of the information from Josh McDowell and his son, Dr. Sean McDowell, from the completely updated and expanded classic, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Chapter 3 is the New Testament historically reliable, and chapter 4 have the Old Testament manuscripts been accurately transmitted. And in those green lines that you see on the screen, these are websites that Josh McDowell and his son have put up on the internet for further reading about the historical reliability of the Bible in how it has been accurately transmitted from one generation to another. Another source of information is number 5, Henry H. Haley's Bible Handbook, Archaeological Note, the Isaiah Scroll, pages 286 to 287. And then in number 6, there is a website entitled The Rabbinic Rules Governing Scribes Copying the Holy Scriptures. And it shows what was expected of each copyist of the Bible to ensure that the Bible was accurately copied. And also in number 7, another website entitled Process of Copying the Old Testament by Jewish Scribes. And so I did my research on this, and you can look especially at the green sections on the screen in your private time for further information. And these are the 3 green sections. Faithful Transmit Old Testament is the title. Another one is number 2, Manuscript Validate Old Testament. And the third one is Bible Human Error. So this will help to reinforce what I have shared with you today. Now, for your homework, I want you to study Lesson 5 entitled Answers to Atheist Criticisms of God Punishing Nations. Lesson 6, Answers to Atheist Accusation of God Approving of Slavery. Lesson 7, answers to atheist accusation of God of child abuse and of the Bible being a poor guide for the treatment of children. And lesson 8, answers to atheist claims that the Bible has not been accurately transmitted. There will be a test on lessons 5, 6, 7, and 8 next week, Friday, October 4, God willing. There will be 8 questions, but you will be required to answer any 4 questions. Remember to choose the questions that you can answer the best. 2 questions will be on lesson 7. 2 questions will be on lesson 8. In lesson 5, know the 3 presuppositions of atheists in judging God for punishing the nations. Know also the 3 principles which God uses to decide whether or not to punish a nation. Know any one case or example of God punishing a nation and how he used the 3 principles in deciding whether or not to punish a nation. In lesson 6, know 5 principles in the Bible which show that God does not approve of slavery. In lesson 7, know 4 presuppositions of atheists concerning God being wrong to command the punishment of children. Be able to show why these 4 presuppositions of atheists are false. In lesson 8, be able to identify the 5 claims of atheists that the Bible has not been accurately copied, and be able to prove that those 5 claims are false. I have tried in this homework assignment, which is really a reading one, to help you to strategically prepare for test number 1 in Introduction to Biblical Apologetics for this 3rd and final trimester of 2019. So if you follow the plan, especially the section in which I've underlined the different lessons, lesson 5, lesson 6, lesson 7, and lesson 8, you will be adequately prepared for the test. I will be sending you this PowerPoint by email later on today, God willing, so that you can look on this last slide in this lesson, lesson number 8, about the copies of the Bible being accurately transmitted, and it will guide you in your preparation for the test. Okay, so you will need to review lessons 5, 6. You already have lessons 5 and 6. I sent them to you last week. I haven't sent to you lessons 7 and 8 as yet. I will be doing so later on this afternoon. So by the time you have lessons 7 and 8 in your email later on today, you will have all of the lessons you need, lessons 5, 6, 7, and 8, which is all we have studied thus far this trimester, in preparing yourselves for your first test in Introduction to Biblical Apologetics. Now this is applicable here, this homework assignment is applicable here to the students at the Jamaica School of Preaching and Biblical Studies. It's not really applicable to the internet audience. So please make sure that you prepare yourselves. There's a lot of reading, and so I would suggest that you take your own time and read little by little each day. But don't try to read all of this information overnight. It doesn't really help. You need to go through it little by little each day and review it and be prepared for the questions next week, Friday, October 4. Any questions on what we have looked at, whether it is the atheist accusing God of child abuse, or whether it is the atheist claiming that the Bible has been inaccurately transmitted or passed down. Any question or comment? Okay, well, this brings us to the end of our introduction to biblical apologetics. And the next class, God willing, is after lunch at 1:30, and we will have our world religions class. In world religions, we'll be looking at lesson number 17, and that is the religion called Sikhism. But before we look at this new religion, we're going to be reviewing the test that you did yesterday, and then we get into that new religion. Lesson 17, Sikhism, Sikhism. God bless you all, and thank you for joining us on the internet. This is Brother Buckland signing off from this program. God bless you.
Thank you.